From Up North News, I'm Pat Kreitlow. Let's unwind the news for this week, where there again were two big stories in the news. One was, of course, the continuing coronavirus outbreak. The other, the continuing protests and demonstrations and rallies that started about police violence, went into systemic racism, and has really called other police tactics into mind, the police role in schools. We'll get into all that with our panel discussion with our reporters, Jonathan Sadowski, Julian Emerson, Jessica Van Egeren. Jessica will also talk about the interview that we'll have for you here, excerpts of her interview with Governor Tony Evers and Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes, where they talk about the twin crises, the obstacles to public health in Wisconsin, and their opinion on whether President Trump is helping or hurting in these twin crises affecting our nation. So let's start first with a look at Jessica Van Egeren's interview with Governor Evers and Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes.
And clearly, regarding, the pandemic, regarding the conversation that people are having all across the state as it relates to systemic racism, healthcare is absolutely right at the core of many of those things. And we've understood that since the day Lieutenant Governor Barnes and I walked in office. So clearly, we knew it ahead of time, but clearly there is a solution out there that unfortunately we have not convinced the Republican legislature to endorse and embrace, and that's expanding Medicaid. Expanding Medicaid will cover more people, give them more people health insurance, but most importantly, it brings in over $1 billion of money to our state to address disproportionate health outcomes that African Americans have, that people of color have. And so one of the answers is right there. And unfortunately, we haven't been able to convince legislators of the importance of that.
Okay. Are you in routine talks with them about this, or what can we do moving forward if we don't? $1 billion, you can do a lot with that money. So what?
Yeah. Well, what I encourage people to do is contact their legislators. I would love to have Mandela and I would love to have ongoing conversations with the Republicans about this, but their leadership says no way. And so having, we can talk to them on a daily basis, but if they say over my dead body, there's not much we can do about it.
Okay. Lieutenant Governor, can you talk a little bit about the community in Milwaukee and I guess what you hear from them, kind of the healthcare issues that they've been most concerned about, including COVID, but prior to that as well?
Yeah, I'll say, with the whole COVID situation, Milwaukee County has been disproportionately impacted. Black and brown people in Milwaukee County and the state of Wisconsin are being disproportionately impacted. But like you said, the issues that existed before COVID is the reason why the impact is that high. Yeah. It is the fact that, it's difficult, for, when when health insurance is tied to employment. And we see now that we are officially in a recession, and the amount of folks who lost their job due to COVID, it helped expose a vital flaw in the system that we have here, because people couldn't keep their health insurance because COVID is not cheap. COVID is very expensive. And for that to be the reality for so many Americans or so many Wisconsinites during COVID showed that, this is the reality for people before the coronavirus showed up here. And that's to say that, without health insurance, people don't have a primary care physician, use emergency rooms to maintain their health. And that creates a problem. It also creates a backlog in the healthcare system. So for, whether it's the healthcare executives I talk to, healthcare workers, or just people in general, they understand the need for us to take that simple first step of expanding Medicaid. Like I said, that is a first step. And mental health professionals too, and even sheriffs across the state. I am blanking on the county at the moment, but I can absolutely get that to you. Where we had a meeting about opiate abuse, about substance abuse in general, and it was with their Department of Human Services. And afterwards, when I was walking back to the car, the sheriff talked to me in the parking lot. He's like, "I didn't vote for you." He's like, I actually ran, I'm a Republican. And he actually may have been a police chief that ran for sheriff. regardless, he's a leader in law enforcement who was a absolute Republican who told me he didn't vote for me, but said that we have to get that Medicaid money. This would help me do my job. And I wish that even then, right when we talked to him, that we got him explaining his case even more, because this isn't a partisan issue. He understands that his community is being ravaged. He understands that there's a need for mental and substance abuse help in those sorts of instances. And as long as police resources are being used to diffuse those types of situations that aren't violent and will require some more professional help, because a lot of police officers aren't trained to deal with people with substance abuse or mental health issues. So he wants to make his community safer by expanding Medicaid.
Yeah. I guess I would think that it's a bit frustrating when you have two pretty big events happening back to back. First you guys are in charge dealing with COVID, then everything happens with George Floyd, and we're dealing with problems that were, there before COVID made them worse, but so much more is focused on that now. I just don't feel like I have much hope that the Republican legislature is going to come back. Like, how do you think about still solving these problems? Is there a way to still get to some of these issues? Because it seems to me that, a lot of people are at the tipping point where they really want resources to start funneling into education, into healthcare, into different public health, programs that can really start to wrap their arms around this. So how do you address that? I mean, is the legislature the only way, Governor, or are there other things and ideas that you have?
Well, first of all, yes, the legislature is the main obstacle here. Can't sugarcoat that. They took that. If Scott Walker would have won, he would have had the power to change that Medicaid expansion by himself. They took that away from me during the lame duck session. So, but here's what gives me hope about this. I want you to have hope too. Is that look at all the people all across the state of Wisconsin that have said enough is enough, right? Mm-hmm. And I don't care whether you're from a homogenous part of the state or not. People now understand how important it is to treat people fairly and equitably. And it's my belief that they will talk to their Republican legislators and say, enough is enough for you too. You need to take a stand here. Clearly, we will continue doing the things around the pandemic that we did before. We have the expertise and the financing right now to do that. But as it relates to a broader scale, that's why I'm very pleased that this protest movement is not only about Madison and Milwaukee. It's about every community in the state, and people understand that. And I believe that will change people's minds.
Okay. Speaking of money, the GOP was using the job numbers that came out on Friday, kind of to say that we might not need another round of stimulus aid, that it might not be necessary. What does Wisconsin need, maybe state or on the state or local level, to make the case that we do need that money here and we would like another stimulus round to come through?
Yeah, well, for sure. I mean, I haven't seen any data, but there's no belief on my part that unemployment rates in Wisconsin for African Americans and Latino folks isn't higher than everybody else's. It's always been, and frankly, we have to make sure that we even with this little change that we saw. So no, there's absolutely a need for stimulus money. Frankly, there's also a need for money to kind of help backfill state and local governments on their revenues. I mean, we can't afford to do anything if we don't have resources, and obviously tax collections are lower. We can't print money that the national federal government can, and they should. That's the way it's always been done in a situation like this.
Do you feel that the president's rhetoric is causing any sort of additional difficulty, I guess, with the demonstrations that are going on? Do you think it's helpful, hurtful? Are you kind of ignoring it?
It ain't helpful. Let's put it that way.
I can't think of many situations that the president stepped in and made it better.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So, okay.
Yeah, I mean, I was part of that phone call when he talked about essentially extreme pressure on people. That's, he's going to be the president of law and order and fix all these things by being uh, overly mean to people. That just that doesn't cut it in anybody's life. We the people of this country have stood up and said enough is enough, and we need to move forward. And unfortunately, if the president doesn't come along with us, we're going to fix it without him.
Now to help us further unwind the news, the Up North News reporters, Jonathan Sadowski, Julian Emerson, Jessica Van Eegeren. Good to see you all. Thanks for being here and for everything you do throughout the course of the week. Obviously, it was another busy week, this third week, as rallies, protests, demonstrations happen all across the country, frankly, all around the world. And that's the noteworthy thing here is it started in Minneapolis. There was the ripple out. We all saw what happened in Madison, Milwaukee, and elsewhere. But Julian, you started working on the story about how this is no longer a big city thing. Not only is it worldwide, but it's getting to smaller communities in Wisconsin. What'd you learn?
Yeah, it was really remarkable to me just to see how far this movement had spread. I was covering it here in Eau Claire, and I wasn't surprised that there were multiple events here, although I was somewhat surprised at the size of them. The last one, organizers say, was 2,500 people or more. So there was a big presence in Eau Claire, and other places like Wausau, La Crosse had multiple protests, Green Bay, Appleton. But the movement expanded beyond that. They were, for instance, in southern Wisconsin, Monroe had 3 days straight of protests. Dodgeville had a couple of protests organized by high school students. And then across northern Wisconsin, in some really small towns, Arborvita, if you've heard of that, they had protest. Places like Barron, Black River Falls, just south of Eau Claire here, and multiple other small towns, Ashland, Hayward, and some of these towns had multiple events.
And in many cases, as I saw somebody write about one particular small community rally, they said, 10% of the population was there, and for that size of a town, getting 10%, that would be like having 83,000 New Yorkers showing up someplace. So this is not like just a handful of people, and even if it's a small group, it's a share of the size. Jess and Jonathan, from a Milwaukee and Madison perspective, things were a lot calmer this week, weren't they? Jess, there wasn't any troubles, just occasionally the occasional caravan and public pronouncements of some type or another.
Yeah, I mean, I think overall now the shift has gone from, there might have been 3 nights of looting, and the demonstrators made it pretty clear that those actions weren't anything associated with them. And the protests actually are continuing. There's one tomorrow. There's a White Coats for Black Lives demonstration on Saturday here in Madison. So I think that one is notable as well, because it seems that we're not just coming out anymore to demonstrate against one specific incident, that the demonstrations that are happening now are more targeted, and they're looking at systemic issues. So that White Coats for Black Lives, that's really looking at the disparities in healthcare.
And that the white coats refer to the lab coats for doctors and nurses and such.
Yep,
yeah,
correct.
Okay.
So this is actually the second one that organization is having. So I think when we talked about systemic impact and what these demonstrations can accomplish, the fact that these are happening with a targeted audience, a targeted message is rather encouraging.
Mm-hmm. Jonathan, we're going to get to what was said in Milwaukee about last week's showdown between police and protesters in just a second, but just I wanted to see if there was anything noteworthy you wanted to share from the past week in the Milwaukee or anywhere in Southeast Wisconsin. Was everything continuing to be peaceful? Anything else of note you wanted to share?
Yeah, things have continued to be peaceful after the first few days. There was some looting. There were some clashes between police and protesters, but for the most part, that has died down. There was, tear gas deployed in both Milwaukee and Racine. As far as I know, that has not come up at all this week. it was just really isolated to the first few days.
Sure, but let's transition into what was said in Milwaukee, where the mayor, Tom Barrett, and city council members wanted to take the police to task, but the police chief was having none of it. Share some of that background for us.
Right. So on June 2nd, there was a group of protesters that in Milwaukee, it was around 7 p.m. So the curfew, which the city had for a few days, was not in effect yet. And what happened was that there was a group of peaceful protesters. Apparently, there were a few throwing, water bottles, some empty, some full. But a man on a bike, he got close to the column of police. They rushed him. Police started shooting tear gas, rubber bullets at the protesters. And this drew some pretty harsh rebukes from 14 out of 15 city aldermen. And also Mayor Barrett, who said that cops shouldn't be using rubber bullets at all and should only be using tear gas in extreme situations. Now, the police chief, he was actually not present at this meeting. I think he showed up for just a few minutes, but then he stepped out for a press conference. And at that press conference, he said that the police are being crucified. He literally compared them to Jesus Christ, saying that, an angry mob is coming to crucify the police.
And that kind of language is simply not helpful, because we've moved not only from systemic racism in law enforcement to exact practices. And Jess, I don't mean to throw a curveball at you, but as a nurse, I don't know that you work with these things necessarily, but when we're talking about rubber bullets, when we're talking about tear gas, these are not feather dusters. These are things that can do real medical harm to protesters, whether they're violent or peaceful. These are not toys.
No, I mean, in fact, a gentleman that I actually worked with in Charleston is in charge of a newsroom now in Indiana, and he hired a freelancer to cover one of the protests there. And I think he was maybe 19, 20, he lost his eye. So, I mean, these things happen.
Yeah. That's happened a few times to reporters as well as to protesters. So police tactics, which were in question going into this, are now in question in a broader way, to the point that different groups or associations have begun to put some distance between themselves and their local police departments. And that's the case with schools as well. Milwaukee has discussed it. Madison has discussed it. Jess, you're in Madison. Julian, you worked on the story. I'm not sure which one of you would like to tell us first about what kinds of things are being discussed. Julian, do you want to start and Jess can jump in?
Sure. Madison, the school board president in Madison came out with a statement saying that she's forming a subcommittee to look at removing police officers from the 4 high schools. However, they will only do that when they also bulk up social workers, counselors, school psychologists, school nurses. So they're basically trying to replace some of those services and actually improve them and provide students with more service to do that. Milwaukee was less definitive. The school board is going to be discussing possibly ending contracts that it has with the police department. It's yet to be determined what exactly that looks like and how far that might go. However, at other school districts around the state, many school leaders say they understand the call for removing officers, but they say that their officers and their schools perform valuable service and help make the schools more safe. So I think it's going to look different in different school districts.
Sure, it's going to be a local call without any doubt. And that was we do a question of the day on our social media feeds on Instagram and Facebook. And it was a very well-rounded batch of answers when we asked people what they thought about replacing police officers with more support staff. And again, the background of this is, cops never wanted to do everything. They didn't go into this to be mental health counselors, drug counselors, etc. Mm-hmm. They were there to solve crimes and to prevent crimes as best they could. But for politicians, it's always easier to put more money into police and weapons than it is to school support staff. But when we put this up as our question of the day, it was noted by several people, why can't you do both? why can't you have an officer, but also provide those other services that students, definitely need in our schools? So it was, a very well-rounded point. There were the people who said, well, how are you going to prevent the next school shooting? And obviously there were a lot of responses right away of, how often has that happened? There have been mass shootings where there was an armed guard or where police were right there. So I don't think we should be letting people get ahead of the larger debate on what's the best use of tax dollars for education safety, and for education services as well. So these topics and more, Jess, came up in your interview with Governor Evers and Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes, where you got into everything happening with law enforcement and then into, the COVID-19 outbreak as well. So it looked like you guys covered a lot of ground in the interview. What was that like?
Yeah, I think we did. And I think, the layeredness of all this is something that we addressed. We all know that there's disparities and there's huge disparity gaps in Wisconsin. COVID-19 hit and kind of lay those disparities, out for everybody to see. It's impacting folks in the African American and Hispanic community, more so than others. And then we had, the rallies, the protests begin, and those also seek to address systemic issues. And that's what the Governor Evers and Lieutenant Governor Barnes were talking about, is that, we need to start addressing these issues. And you can't fix these problems unless you start to put money kind of where your mouth is. We need to expand Medicaid. We need to have more people insured. There's really no other way to address this kind of stuff. And we're kind of in a, I don't know, what do you want to say? Like
we're a stalemate where you've got a governor who has been saying since day one that one of the best things to do is expand Medicaid, for example, which the governor noted other states led by Republicans have, changed course, and they're now doing it. But what did the lieutenant governor had a colorful way of putting what he thought the legislative situation was on this.
What did he say?
He said it was, the legislature's being held hostage by a pack of ideologues.
Yeah.
That was how he put it. And frankly, again, I think they're putting some markers down for an election year, and hopefully, maybe they're trying to move the needle with public opinion to get Republicans, some of them anyway, or some candidates to moderate their stance and say, maybe this is the thing that they should be doing. But, the governor, lieutenant governor did point out that these twin crises, they're definitely both public health crises.
Oh yeah, for sure. So, it'd be nice if we could see some movement. The governor has said before that this is a watershed moment, and you would hope that watershed moments lead to action. I think the stories that we did with Julian, the fact that there are so many protests in smaller, wider communities in Wisconsin, and the governor commented on that as well. People want to see change. So how we're going to go about that, if the legislature doesn't want to move, then, people on the ground have to keep pushing for that change. So,
yeah, especially when you have an obstacle as big as the president of the United States, in the way. And how did Governor Evers say that about the president and the phone call? When he said, "Oh, it ain't helpful," as only the governor can say. Let's wrap up our remaining time talking about, we mentioned the elections are coming up, and the coronavirus outbreak has obviously increased the popularity of absentee balloting. You can do it in the safety of your own home, not go to a polling place, do it at your convenience. It's something that has been embraced by both parties in many states, but not here in Wisconsin, Jonathan. And you have a state elections commission that is set up with 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans, so that, depending on how you look at it, there has to be bipartisan agreement to do something, or it's set up for gridlock. Either way, we're closer to a decision on sending out absentee ballot applications, but we're not quite there yet, are we?
Right. So the commission has already decided to send out absentee ballot applications for 2.7 million voters in the state. Now, the issue is that they added another roadblock for themselves, which is that they want to approve the specific language. They want to see the mailers first, which is reasonable, of course, that you would want to know what you're sending out. But we ran into another roadblock yesterday in a day-long meeting. One of the many items discussed was these mailers that they're going to be sending out later this year. And there was some back and forth over some of the language on it. One of the Republican appointees, Robert Spindell, he wanted a citizenship question on it, which doesn't make a lick of sense, really.
Yeah, let's call a timeout on that, because the ballot apps are going to registered voters who
Correct.
have to show ID and prove citizenship. I believe the Democratic members of the panel made that clear as well.
Yeah, they really piled on him. And, he was saying that he doesn't want people to doubt the process, doubt the election, that there was voter fraud, though that is also a baseless concern, because voter fraud in vote by mail is so minuscule. It's like 0.0002% in studies that have been done on it. So it's such a non-issue that it's just one of the talking points that's been brought up. And it's one of the things that kind of helped hold up these mailers once again. So the commission has to come back next week to approve all the changes that the staff is going to make to these mailers. And if the vote doesn't get done next week, then they're going to miss their printing deadline, because the meeting next week is next Wednesday and the deadline is next Friday. So they have a 2-day window. So it's really going to come down to the wire here.
Right. And so there are definitely two ways to look at it. The one is that they're having great difficulty, but are trying to get to this deadline. But I would not fault anybody for thinking that perhaps there's some intentional foot dragging, running out the clock, because there is this Republican position, not all of them, of course, but some that do not want to encourage absentee ballots. And so I just wonder if the Republican members of that commission are aware of the way that these delays are being, seen by others. But we won't know until we see next week's meeting and see if we have that done, or if we are again going to be faced with very tight deadlines for voters to return their ballots, or if not, then they have to go stand in line in both August and November. So we'll obviously monitor that next week as well. Well, guys, thank you very much for helping with the unwind here. Julian Emerson, Jonathan Sadowski, Jessica Van Egren. Good to see you all. Have a great weekend.
Thanks.
You too.
And thank you for joining us as we unwind the week. I'm Pat Kreitlow. You can find our stories anytime at UpNorthNewsWI.com. Don't forget the WI. Same thing for finding us on your favorite social media feeds. And at our website, you can sign up for our daily newsletters, the morning and or the afternoon ones. We'd love to have you on board for each day as we unwind the news for you. I'm Pat Kreitlow. Have a great week.